Hello class, welcome to our first lecture in psychology. Let's cut to the chase and get to the definitions of what psychology is. Well, there are two parts to the term, psych, P-S-Y-C-H, and that literally means soul. And then there's the ology part, the scientific study of, hence psychology, the scientific study of the mind and behavior. Now, let me emphasize that the important part of the definition of psychology is not just that we study the mind and we study behavior, both of which emerge from the history of psychology, but the most important term in its definition is scientific. That's going to be explored in more detail in Chapter 2, where we explore the various research methods. Because without a science in the study of psychology, we really don't have much, do we? When you think about it. In fact, I'm also going to ask you to explore the PowerPoint that I included in there, and I believe you'll find that in Chapter 2, and it talks about the methods of scientific inquiry, but also describes some of the other areas that give the appearance of being psychological, but aren't really. We call those pseudosciences. But more on that later. But do reach into the Chapter 2 folder, the methodology folder, and take a look at that PowerPoint presentation that I include in there. Psychologists study everything, albeit scientifically, about the human experience, from basic workings of the human brain, which we will explore in this course, to consciousness, memory, language, reasoning, personality, and mental health. The history of psychology is largely governed by perspectives. And some of the perspectives I want to enumerate over here, and they're also explicated in more detail in your textbook, are structuralism, functionalism, psychoanalytic theory, Gestalt psychology, behaviorism, and humanism. And by the way, the chapter after research methods goes to the chapter on learning, and you'll see we're really going to drill into the contributors, Pavlov, Watson, and Skinner, and which largely forms the behaviorist model. But let's begin with Wilhelm Wundt, who started the first research laboratory in 1879. In fact, in 1979, well before you were born, we celebrated our 100th anniversary. See, Wilhelm Wundt is frequently referred to as the father of modern psychology, or minimally one of the founders of psychology. And that's largely because he created the first laboratory for psychological research. He emphasized structuralism, which is a focus on the understanding of the structure and characteristics of the mind, and the technique that he employed, and it wasn't his only technique, but this is what he's largely known for, is called introspection. What is introspection? It is the process by which someone examines their own conscious experience in an attempt to break it into its component part. A contemporary of Wundt was William James, and he developed the perspective, the psychological perspective, called functionalism. And he was heavily influenced by evolutionary theory. He drew from the functionality of cognitive processes and argued that the various cognitive processes of us are adaptive in the sense. So he saw emphasized the importance of studying the functional aspects of it: emotional experience, hostility, anger. All of these are adaptive, right? Emotions have an adaptive role. But more importantly, functionalism in and of itself emphasized how mental activities contributed to basic environmental survival. Now, of course, everyone's heard of Sigmund Freud. He was a highly influential figure in the history of psychology, although rather technically his historical path was a little different than others, but we don't have to explore that in this introductory course. One of his many books, A General Introduction to Psychoanalysis, shared his ideas about psychoanalytic therapy, and it was published in 1922. But we're going to explore more Sigmund Freud. It was just one of those perspectives Sigmund Freud contributed to it. But a little bit more on it, he developed the idea of psychoanalytic theory. He founded psychoanalytic theory, and it dominated clinical psychology for many, many decades, and he studied hysteria and neuroses. We're going to talk about those pathological states at the end of this semester under the heading of abnormal psychology, or sometimes more commonly called psychopathology. He theorized that many patients' problems arose from the unconscious mind. He believed that one way the unconscious mind could be accessed was through dream analysis, which I'm going to tell you I'm not a fan of, which because even to date we have not established a sound scientific basis of the meaningfulness of dreams. But in any case, psychoanalytic theory also focuses on the role of a person's unconscious and early childhood experiences. Another perspective is Gestalt psychology, which, by the way, means whole. And the three individuals most associated with that perspective, and we're talking about the early part of the 20th century, is Kohler, Kafka, and Wertheimer. These were German psychologists who immigrated to the United States to escape Nazi Germany. And it is based on the idea that although a sensory experience can be broken down into individual parts, which was largely a structuralist perspective, how those parts relate to each other as a whole is often what the individual responds to in perception. I believe Gestalt psychology is covered with a little more detail in your chapter, so please explore that in a little more detail. The ideas of Gestalt continue to influence research in areas such as sensation and perception. Well, one of my favorite, Ivan Pavlov, the Russian physiologist, who discovered the concept of classical conditioning. And he studied conditioned reflexes in which an animal produces a reflex, which is unconscious, responds to a stimulus, and over time is conditioned to produce the response to a different stimulus that the experiment associated with the original stimulus. This is sometimes called associative learning. We're going to explore that in more detail under the topic of learning. So please bear with me in the in how scant I'm treating him right now. Another significant figure is John B. Watson, which we will again explore in the section on learning. He's known as the father of behaviorism within psychology, and he believed that objective analysis of the mind was impossible. Instead, he focused on observable behavior and ways to bring that behavior under control. Today, behaviorism is used in behavioral and cognitive behavioral therapies, and later on, that is towards the end of the semester, we're going to talk about one particular technique which was developed by the behaviorists called systematic desensitization. Very, very effective in deconditioning fear responses. And then there's B.F. Skinner. He concentrated on how behavior was affected by its consequences, typically called operant conditioning. There too, we're going to explore operant conditioning in more detail. He studied the principles of modifying behavior through reinforcement and punishment, which he saw as major factors in driving behavior. Now, we pivot away from the behaviorist perspective. We can take a peek at Abraham Maslow, one of two humanists. As Abraham Maslow, and the other one's Carl Rogers. And he proposed a hierarchy of human needs in motivating behavior. Maslow asserted that so long as basic needs necessary for survival were met, for example, food, water, and shelter, higher level needs, such as social needs, would begin to motivate behavior. And he created a triangle illustrating these particular needs, going from physiological needs, which I just alluded to the highest hierarchy of needs, which he called self-actualization. And again, if you properly review your textbook, you will see a more than adequate illustration of Abraham Maslow's hierarchy of needs. And as I just mentioned, Carl Rogers, he developed a client-centered therapy method that has been influential in clinical settings and still influences us today. In client-centered therapy, it involves the patient taking a lead role in the therapeutic process. Rogers believed that therapists need unconditional positive regard, genuineness, and empathy. More on that a little later. When we get to the section on cognition and memory, I will briefly talk about the cognitive revolution, because by the 1950s, a whole new disciplinary perspective developed. Linguistics, neuroscience, computer science. They were all emerging areas. And the mind became the new focus of scientific inquiry. And Margaret Floyd Walsh, and these are other names, I mention them because they are described more extensively in your textbook, and I just want to mention them. They are worth mentioning. Margaret Floyd Washburn, W-A-S-H-B-U-R-N, was the first woman to earn a doctorate in psychology, and she did research on animal behavior and published an authoritative text on psychology. Now, in contemporary psychology, and owing to the history that I very, very briefly described, we have branches of psychology. See, psychology is a very, very multifaceted field with many, many different parts. We have biopsychology and evolutionary psychology, sensation and perception, cognitive psychology, developmental psychology, personality psychology, social psychology, health psychology, industrial organizational psychology, sports and exercise psychology, clinical psychology, and a favorite of many, many students, forensic psychology. Well, in enumerating some of these branches, you'll probably recognize that many of them are going to be covered in this course. It's just simply beyond the scope of one semester course in introductory psychology to cover everything that I just enumerated to you. But let's dig into some of them. Biopsychology, which is a section that we are going to cover several chapters from now, and I believe it's the chapter that follows memory. The chapters are going to be learning, right? And then that's going to be memory, and then biopsychology. Okay. The biological psychology study how the structure and function of the nervous system generate behavior. And we're going to get into the nervous system. And in fact, we're going to talk about things like sensory and motor systems, and some of the neurons, the function of neurons, etc. And the implications of studying these biological subsystems is that they contribute to understanding sleep, drug use and abuse, ingestive behavior, reproductive behavior, neurodevelopment, plasticity of the nervous system, and biological correlates of psychological disorder, which you will find very interesting when we talk about clinical depression and so forth. Another area of inquiry, sensation and perception, which, by the way, moi, Professor J, spent many, many years in this particular area. It focuses on both the physiological aspects of sensory systems and the psychological experience of sensory information. I did quite a bit of work on backward visual masking. I'm not going to get into it in any significant detail right now. We, myself and Dr. John Andriassi, studied sensory information experiences, both auditory, visual, and so forth. In fact, sensory information constitutes sight, sounds, touch, smell. And then, there's the sensory experience, and then, of course, there's the perception, which is the experience of the world, which is influenced by where we focus our attention. Developmental psychology, which we're going to cover here as well, studies the physical and mental attributes of aging and maturation. And this can include various skills that are acquired throughout growth. And in there, developmental psychologists will explore moral reasoning, cognitive skills, social skills, and in fact, one individual, which we will explore in more detail, and I've got some interesting YouTube video clips demonstrating some of Jean Piaget's concepts. He's famous for his theories regarding changes in cognitive ability that occur as we move from infancy to adulthood. We'll talk about that more a little bit later. It's really interesting stuff that has implications for how you will treat your children and how teachers learn how to treat children. Then there's personality psychology, which focuses on behaviors and thought patterns that are unique to each individual. Studies in this field include conscious and unconscious thinking and identifying personality traits. And in particular, there is what's called the 5-factor model called OCEAN, which stands for openness, conscientiousness, extroversion, and agreeableness and neuroticism. And the neuroticism component doesn't relate to the psychopathological condition of neuroticism. In fact, these so-called personality traits, these 5 fundamental traits, are not pathological, but arguably something that we all possess to some degree. And we'll talk about that more a little bit later. It's really interesting, and if you come to Baruch College as an undergraduate, I also teach a course in political psychology, and actually I have students do a personality assessment utilizing the 5-factor model because personality psychologists want to know if personality traits, and that is how one scores relatively low and high on the OCAN model, could predict one's political orientation, whether you are conservative or whether you are progressive. Then there's the area of social psychology, and in this field, individuals interact and relate with others and how such interactions can affect behavior. And areas of inquiry in social psychology are prejudice, attraction, interpersonal conflicts, and obedience. Then there's health psychology. It's a branch that focuses on how individual health is directly related or affected by biological, psychological, and social cultural influences. The biopsychosocial model suggests that health and illness is determined by an interaction of 3 factors: biological, psychological, and social cultural influences. Clinical psychology, which we are going to, oh, by the way, we're not going to study extensively health psychology. I just mention it as one of those areas of psychological inquiry. Like I mentioned earlier, we just don't have time in a 1-semester course to explore everything in psychology. But health psychology is truly a fascinating field, especially when you explore it within the context of the current COVID pandemic. Okay, but more on that later. Clinical psychology, which I've already alluded to, which focuses on diagnosis and treatment of psychological disorders. And we're also going to explore later in the semester industrial organizational psychology. This is the branch that applies psychological theories and principles in research to IO settings, industrial organizational settings, typically work settings. And this involves issues related to personnel management, organizational structure, and workplace environment. And incidentally, Baruch College, the school that you are now part of, welcome, houses the doctoral program in industrial organizational psychology. Other areas of interest: sports and exercise psychology and forensic psychology. Let's now pivot to careers in psychology. most careers in psychology require a PhD or a master's degree. As I just mentioned, Baruch College houses the PhD program in industrial organizational psychology, but they also house a master's program in mental health counseling, a relatively new program here at Baruch, but very, very, very popular. But there are a few career options in psychology. There's teaching, research. Teaching and research are two areas that I'm most noted for. Careers in psychology include becoming a clinical psychologist or a counseling psychologist, social work, corporate and marketing jobs. And their employment in different sectors is rather broad. And I believe this is outlined in your textbook. You have psychologists, about 1 in 4 of them, about 26%, employed in universities. Another 25% are employed in hospital and health services, 16% in government VA medical centers, and then there are those employed in business or nonprofit organizations. 6% are in medical schools, and 6% are in independent practice. And don't memorize these numbers. I'm just spewing out to you. I just wanted to give you a sense of the distribution of the employment sector for psychologists. And there are many, many job opportunities for psychologists. And top occupations employing graduates with a BA in psychology. Yeah, it is possible. It is possible to become employed just with an undergraduate degree in psychology, but that's very, 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 very difficult. So while you may consider psychology as an undergraduate major and then decide not to pursue further, your options are really, I'm just being frank with you, they are very, very limited. But in some cases, individuals do make it into other areas. I think the highest ranking is in mid and top level management. I've seen many Baruch College students, those majoring in management, also major in psychology because, minor rather, in psychology because they felt that that the subject matter in those areas might help them in that endeavor. But you could explore that in the textbook and and take from it what you may. All right, I'm kind of like done. Oh, by the way, typically my lectures will not last more than 20 minutes. So please, when you play this back, don't play it back sped up, make me sound like a munchkin or something like that. Of course, that's your prerogative to do so. And if there's anything in this video presentation that lacks clarity, you could always go back and play it back, and I encourage you to do so. So jump on chapter 1, get through that, and if you haven't already done so, jump into chapter 2, because next week I'm going to promptly begin lecturing on research methods, psychological research, and I consider that to be probably one of the most important chapters, one of the most important things that you could learn in psychology today. All right, guys, later. Have a good one.